Okay, let me welcome all of you to the first afternoon session of today. I have with me two prominent analysts and observers of social movements, Ivan Krastev, chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia and permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and Aleksander Smolar, who is the chairman of Batory Foundation in Warsaw, a political scientist based both in Paris and Warsaw. I'm Paweł Marczewski. I'm head of publications at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. The idea behind this panel was basically to continue, in a way, the discussion that was started by Jacek Kołtan and his guests before the lunch break. But we wanted to focus the discussion on something more specific than just to give to give a huge overview of what's happening with new social movements across the globe. And the idea behind this panel was basically to try to look what happens with new social movements, with protest movements, massive mobilizations around certain issues, like, for example, protesting against ACTA agreement. What happens with all these movements when they try to enter mainstream politics, when they try to enter more institutionalized politics, which means in particular party politics, and on the other hand, what happens to political parties that are faced with social movements like that? Do they change as a result of this meeting? Are they forced to revise their functioning, some of their crucial programmatic proposals? So basically, because I have the impression that when the Occupy movement broke out, when the Indignados took to the main squares in Barcelona and Madrid, when activists, the so-called activists, took to streets in cities across Poland, a lot of people were saying, okay, but what is the concrete political result of all of this, apart from maybe in the Polish case, Polish government simply not signing the deal? What are the long-term lasting results of all these mobilizations? And can actually any lasting mobilizations be achieved without this political movements entering nitty-gritty, down-to-earth, everyday politics? So this is the question that is behind this panel. And before I give my guests opportunity to look into this problem, let me start by offering a kind of general typology of parties inspired by social movements or fueled by the energy of social movements, or social movements that were turned into parties. This typology is rather pessimistic. On one, you have, of course, the Greek case, the case of Syriza, which was not a party formed on the basis of a social movement that existed before, but of course it wouldn't probably win the elections if it wasn't for the massive mobilization against austerity politics in Greece. You have a case of Podemos, of course, which is obviously a party which would not be possible without Indignados, but on the other hand, it was organized in a kind of a top-down manner. Podemos would probably not come into existence if it wasn't for a few political scientists from Madrid who basically came up with the idea of creating a new political party that would break this hegemony of two major parties in Spain. And you have a Polish case, which is a rather interesting one, because you have a new left-wing party which is struggling for recognition, which is struggling to get a broader popular support. It's called Razem, Together. But this party, even though it didn't manage to get into parliament, is rather efficient in mobilizing people on Facebook. Some are even joking that if Facebook likes were like electoral votes, their leader would probably already be a Polish prime minister. But nevertheless, this party managed to bring people into the streets when the government was toying with the idea of voting for a much harsher anti-abortion law. So you have Syriza, kind of party associated with protest movements in Greece that nevertheless gave in to more mainstream politics, and some say abandoned its ideas. Not to mention that it totally overturned the result of a referendum that it has itself organized. And you have Podemos, which, even though it managed to get into parliament and got, in the repeated elections in June, got a third place, is still struggling to break this hegemony of two major parties, as it promised. So if you agree to this typology, so basically a new movement-inspired political party that gave in, a party that is still struggling to change the political mainstream, and a party which is outside of the mainstream but is rather efficient when it comes to organizing street protests, well, can we really be optimistic about perspectives of political parties that are inspired and fueled by the energy of social movements? Because there doesn't seem to be much change happening.
Thank you very much. And I will not try to define what is a movement, but I will try to make important, from my point of view, why people who are part of them insist calling themselves a movement. What they basically feel kind of uncomfortable with is the idea that they're party, which means that they're part, because they want to represent something different, a certain type of totality, not all people, but where basically civil society stands. And this is very typical. By the way, Mr. Trump also calls himself a movement, and he has the same characteristics. You're not speaking simply on a certain type of a particular interest. You don't pretend that you're just trying to enter politics as a representative of this. You're representing something different. And what you represent is not so much a certain idea, but the intensity of the sentiment about what is going on. And do you know what? Elections cannot represent intensity. This is part of the mystery of the elections, because elections are about people who are very much interested in politics and people who are not very much interested, and all of them has one vote. And this is very important, because this is how you're producing certain moderation. But these people going on the street, for them it's very important not simply to produce and to claim what they stand, but the strengths of which they stand for this. This is why, in my view, the influence of these movements cannot be translated simply to the success of the political parties that have been born there. And I'm going to say something about the parties. Normally, this type of movements are articulating new agenda and new consensus. And this is not just on the left or on the right. Here, probably many people will disagree, but Occupy movement influenced, of course, Mr. Sanders, but it also influenced Mr. Trump supporters. You have a new consensus. And the new consensus is that free trade is problem, and also free movement is problem, where basically what Mr. Trump got from the problem of anti-globalization discourse. This became a new consensus exactly because it was not articulated by one of the party or the other of the party, but it came as a kind of a shout on behalf of the society as a whole. And I do believe the influence of these movements comes there. The second influence is very much how they're changing the people participating. Part of the problem with the literature on the movements is that the first 5 years, all the books that you're going to read are coming from the people that have been on the street. And this is quite important, because all these movements are also very specific type of experience, because we are talking about solidarity and being here. There is one figure about Poland and solidarity that for me was the most striking things I have ever heard. In 1981, during the classical solidarity period, the consumption of alcohol in Poland declined 4 times. People were drunken with the idea of freedom and their own importance, and this is very important. This experience is very important. And people normally, when they talk about these movements, they communicate their experience, how they felt, not what they want. So from this point of view, these movements are influential to the extent that they can articulate new language, new messages, which can be taken by everybody. And this is their strength and their weakness, because everybody can take this energy and to use it. What happens with the parties? Here's, of course, where it comes to the ironic part of it. By the way, if you see all these revolutions that have been on the street, 20 years ago, the revolution used to have political names. When people go on the street, you're going to know who is there. Communists, fascists. Now they have a company names. Twitter revolution, Facebook revolution. Because from this point of view, exactly, the ideological profile is not very clear. This is the energy, this is the anger, but not very clear what these people are going to do if they're going to be in power, because they claim that they don't want to be in power. The irony is that the major experience that this type of movements were trying to communicate to the world was, we are leaderless, networks, not organizations, total participation. Look at the political parties that they produce. This is one of the most hierarchical and old-fashioned parties you can imagine. Podemos, it's a very leader party, to the extent that on the first European elections, it was the face of Mr. Iglesias that was on the ballot. Syriza, it's very much a leader. So this is a very strange gap between the experience of the people, what they do believe that they experience on the street while protesting, and the political products that came out of it. Because in politics, organization matters, institutions matters, and strangely enough, this party has something very different to do. Two more things which I find kind of important about the influence of these movements. I do believe one of the second most important influence of these movements is that the reaction that they produced, counter-reaction. I do believe it was Roger Debray who was talking about the revolutionary power to revolutionize the counter-revolution. But this is very important. I have been personally studying much more places like Russia, Turkey, my own country. Look at Turkey. Why it was so important? Because in a certain way it was very much minority-driven social movements which are making a valid point, but then on the political story they allowed a certain very different type of majority to be consolidated. When Mr. Erdogan was talking to the protesters in Taksim, he said a phrase which was critically important. He said, "We are the people. Who are you?" And the problem is that these movements are legitimate only in the moment when they're on the street. When they disappear from the street, their legitimacy disappeared. And then comes the elections. And as a result of these movements, one of the interesting impact is a major majoritarianism coming in different places, because the emergence of this very active minority produces demand for a clear majority. And these majorities have been, some of them, very conservative. And I'm here going to use even not so much the term conservative, but some of them are very reactionary. In a classical sense, Mark Lilla just published a book on this, which I find quite important. Because conservatives are those who argue with the liberals about human nature. Reactionary argues with the revolutionary about the direction of history. And here comes my last point, because I do believe that these movements are very much affecting the way that democracy starts to function these days. Tocqueville, in Democracy in America, made an observation which is very critical for me. He said democracy is based on over-dramatization and trivialization at the same time. You go for the elections, and you're saying that this is the end of the world. This is such an important problem. Every election is the most important elections. And then the election is over, and people said the problems, in fact, are solvable. You can live with this. It's kind of a ritual in which you have intensification, but after that, trivialization. And part of the strength of democracy, and this is why governments like democracies, that when the elections are over, opposition is in a way demobilized for a while. They start to ask why was the elections, the leader is going to leave and so on. This is not the logic of the political movements. Because the political movements, and here Mr. Trump is a very important example, claims something which is very important. The next elections doesn't matter. Everything is going to be decided now. This is the critical moment. If today we didn't stop the wrong development of the country, everything is going to be doomed. And this is why this type of movements do not demobilize after the elections. This is why we have the rise of contested elections in Western democracies. And this is why, by the way, this is the irony, but if you look at the elections of the United States and Austria, they now started very much to resemble the elections in Eastern Europe or even the post-Soviet space. Austrians has a third round of the presidential elections, which normally the Ukrainians do. And also they decided to postpone the round because of technical irregularities. This is normally what we do in the Balkans. And basically, if you listen the discourse of the Clinton campaign with respect to the Russian interference in the American politics, which I do believe is real, but it is very much the discourse of the Russians from some years ago about the Americans' intervention in their politics. So from this point of view, and this is my last point, I do believe that not simply they affected the agenda, some of these movements, not simply that they affected some of the political parties that emerged, but because of the nature exactly being a movements that claim that future, in a way, doesn't matter. Everything is going to be decided now. They're changing the nature of the politics, and they're creating this very strange situation in which you have a polarized politics that does not reconcile and does not recede when the elections are over. So I'll stop here.
This is quite striking how many different definitions, explicitly or implicitly, of social movements we had already today. We had in the morning populist movements practically included in social movements. Actually, in what Ivan was saying, it's also that which exist as a political parties, you are considering them also as a part of political movement. This is very interesting. I would tempted to limit myself to the marching, to the social movements. If I can give a lousy definition, very narrow definition, that this is the way of new interests and new values entering in the public space and in political space, which are not represented. Actually, Trump, this is an example. This is restructuring of all political space, probably of America, and entering of new interests, of new perception of the reality. Afterwards, the way you defined this, that in a way social movements are organized themselves against partiality of political parties, in the name of totality. This is exactly one of defining, it seems to me, futures of the populism. This is the people against elites or against technocrats. The different languages are used. So this is a real problem. We can see that on conceptual, even on the level of definition, there is a problem already how defined. I do agree with a lot of what you said. Whether today is it only characteristic for the movements? Isn't it also characteristic for today's parties, political parties? The problem of the crucial problem of the crisis of political parties we observed from the 70s already, in the US, but also in Europe. This is a rising feeling that of inefficiency of political, that the limit of what is possible is more and more limited, the possibility of action. And especially with globalization, full-fledged development of globalization, this is quite obvious that national governments can do very little. And in a way, what we can observe, the revolt, mass movements of populism, I will not. This is revolt against impossibility. I remember the sentence I read somewhere, not in origin, of Rathenau, who said it already after First World War, that both communism and fascism, this is reaction against market society, which is very interesting. This is very close to, we can say, about today's situation. Fortunately, you cannot compare the type of movements which are reacting. But this is sort of reaction against impossibility. Actually, it's the term impossibility which was used by the ruler, although formally he's not exercising any function, by Kaczynski 10 years ago. Today, he's avoiding any formulas which can compromise him. He was telling about impossibilism. Impossibilism, did he define impossibility? It means that power, which should be able to do everything, cannot do anything because of institutional, legal and constitutional constraints. So this is why it explained also his policy against constitutional court and so on and so on. Now, coming back to social movement, I find quite amazing statement about when the question was posed to one very well-known Polish sociologist or social thinkers who is living for ages already in Great Britain, Zygmunt Bauman, who used a comparative which seems to be quite shocking. See, he used the concept of Mikhail Bakhtin, a Russian very well-known philosopher and critic, literary theatrical critic, of social function of the carnival. The social function of the carnival, that this is exceptional events, a few days events where all the rules are changed, where the people are behaving very differently than in normal times, constrained by all possible constraints, social, cultural, political, and so on. And paradoxically, it has a function of stabilizing the system. Because this is this sort of frustration. After those a few days, those people are back in their normal life. And he was very skeptical. The question was posed about Polish, I will talk about it, about Polish movements and about possible their efficiency. So he said quite explicitly that this is moral function, that this is preserving certain values, but it was quite obvious that he was not attaching any importance to the movements as a transforming factor. It was very interesting that you, Paweł, you limited yourself to those two parties in your example, and I think that the social movements that their influence. First, that this is not only political parties. Political influence can be much bigger, and we are here in the center of solidarity tradition. Solidarity, it was certainly social movements, quite possibly the biggest social movement in the history, and it gets enormous transformative effects for the whole political system, not one party. Of course, with the delay, let's say 80-81, it was a revolution without revolutionary consequences. In 89, the revolutionary consequences with revolution. But in a way, it was a process. It was two stages process. So you cannot exclude that. And this is quite obvious that the question which is posed to us, this is the problem of relation social movements and to politics, is debated very much, even if the terms are different in Polish political debates, especially among the people of the opposition. Whether political parties, the left disappeared totally from the scene, at least for the time being. We have two liberal parties and one small, mentioned by you, Razem, very small, which is also outside of parliament, Razem party, which is close in its message to Podemos, more or less. So natural question which was posed, can we expect, I'm talking about opposition, any solution to this government, which is not calling itself illiberal, but they are very close to Orban, who defined his regime as illiberal democracy, and I think that this is a good definition, at least for the time being. Or the question was posed, and because of tradition of solidarity, and of course solidarity tradition is very much in the heads of both camps. Both camps comes from solidarity. This is from the breakdown of the solidarity camp. And we didn't mention yet, after election 1 year ago, we had two very interesting authentic social movements. First, we have still, although today seems to be not in very good shape. This is Komitet Obrony Demokracji, the Committee of Defense of Democracy. The allusion to core Committee of Defense of the Workers, which played a very important role in the creation of solidarity, is quite obvious. And we had a manifestation, public manifestation of tens of thousands, several times, of people. With limited efficiency. Let's say the authorities were shocked, but with limited, I will finish already. This is very interesting. This is a generational phenomenon. The people who are participating in those, this is most of all about the danger for constitutional court and for the constitution, let's say. So the fundamentals of the democratic liberal constitutional order. Those are middle-aged and older people, the people formed by the experiences of solidarity and by 89. Younger people are in very limited, to very limited extent are present in those movements. And we had the second movement, which was mentioned twice, which was very interesting. And the first case, the authorities were forced to withdraw their project, constitutional project. This is the movement of most of all of young people, of the young women. This is against the project, very restrictive abortion law. Actually, it was eliminating any possibility of abortion. Polish law, anyway, is extremely conservative, the most in Europe or maybe in competition with another country. So it was considered as a shock. Very important. We had 100,000 not long ago, 100,000 people, young people mostly, in the street. They were not talking in the most cases about abortion, but of freedom of choosing, and not the state shouldn't intervene in the individual lives of citizens. And the authorities, they were forced to withdraw. It was a political effect. But it shows something which we can observe in the West as well. That first, the young people are not participating, or much less participating in formal political process in the elections, and we have everywhere this phenomenon. They are not participating in this sort of general manifestation. They are participating when their interests and their values are in danger directly. In ACTA, for example, anti-ACTA movements, it was the movement of young people, and now this around abortion law. So, and I think that it shows also intelligence of Kaczynski. He understood that these movements, which much bigger participation of the older people, but very general for a big part of the population, abstract in a way subject, defense of constitutional court, are less dangerous for them than this movement concerning very particular problem of formally of abortion. That potentially this is much more destabilizing a revolutionary movement. So I will finish here.
So let me pick up on parts of what both of you said. You said even that these movements have an important thing in common, namely they all act as if it was the end of times all the time. As if every electoral cycle was the end of the world, potentially at least. The world that has to be saved, and it can be only saved by this particular movement that is advocating for its cause. On the other hand, there is the example of solidarity, and as probably all of you who did the guided tour yesterday remember, there was an attempt to revive the spirit of solidarity a few years after the martial law in 1988. There was an attempt to organize a second strike. Nothing came out of it. And then a year later, we have the round table. I mean, not even a year later, we have a round table. Then a year later, we have the first semi-free elections. So is the lesson from all of this that basically new social movements that are trying to enter the mainstream and change the mainstream, do they simply have to learn patience?
No, listen. For sure, the classical example is 1968. Something big, and then basically nothing happening, and 20 years later you have the feeling that it has much more transformative effect in social and cultural life than many of the successful political revolutions. So from this point of view, of course, the time horizon matters. For me, the interesting story also of what you are saying is, and if you go back to solidarity, why solidarity was very much rooted in the communist understanding of history, nevertheless it has an anti-communist pathos. Because the idea that the future belongs to the workers was not contested. And this is why the workers coming with their own idea, the idea of the future was totally different. When I was asking about the debt and about the demographic fear comings of people to your society and trying to change it, I do believe that the interesting moment in which we are living, and this is the West, what I'm saying, is true for the West, I don't believe it's true for the other part of the world, is that because the West is losing part of its powerful and privileged position in the global world system, we're starting to experience politics differently. If you go back to Mr. Kaczynski and some of these so-called liberal movements, I do believe that they're putting questions to two parts of liberal democracy that now people start to question. One is liberal democracy was always very attractive because when you're losing, you're not losing much. You're losing for the moment, but you know that in 4 years less, they're going basically to be new elections. And also you're not losing much because you have all these constraints coming from constitutional court, from here, from there. But the other side of not losing much is that the winner is not winning much. Part of the strength of the message of particularly East European populist movements who are questioning the idea of transition was it a victory? Whose victory it was? And I find this quite important because, strangely enough, and from here, Occupy Wall Street and Mr. Trump are sending also a message which is quite important. By the way, Piketty book is, if you're reading Camo, is the same message. Social inequality is never kind of reduced simply by poor people becoming richer. Something bad should happen to the rich people. And if you see the American elections, and by the way, this is in the Bulgarian politics for the last 10 years, see where is the fantasy of the people. The Trump people want her locked in a prison. And the Clinton people want him locked in a madhouse. But basically, the idea is as if it's a kind of a clash between the criminal and the crazy. This idea of understanding of politics in which basically the other side is part of a normal political cycle is disappearing exactly because what has changed is the idea of time. We are living in such a critical time that you cannot allow the other side to win. Even more, you are not going to accept, you're going to contest this victory because this victory is going to be totally destructive. And for me comes the question which was troubling me for a long time. Is there a certain, to what extent the very idea of liberal democracy is based on the fact that future is something that in general we expect to be positive? To what extent the fact that in 4 years we can redecide certain things is there? If you don't buy this assumption, there's the democracy starting to change its meaning. Because I do believe for democracy to function, the stakes should be neither too low nor too high. If nothing matters, and by the way, this was the experience of many East Europeans, you go in the elections. In Bulgaria, we never re-elected government. For 25 years, nobody was re-elected. But you're changing governments, you cannot change policy. As a result of it, the feeling of losing power is becoming stronger. And this is the paradox of the globalized world. We are freer than ever before. At the same time, you feel less powerful than ever before. How are you doing with these two? How basically you're trading this off? Because we are freer. But listen, our rights are better protected. Go back. Why freedom is not related to our power? Why our power basically depends on other things. And I find this quite important for the way why people started to be angry, and they started to be angry to things that normally liberals perceived that people are going to be positive about. For example, this dismantling of the check and balances, courts, media, NGOs, attack of this is a commonplace everywhere. Go Turkey. Why people are not, why in a strange way, even Poles who are quite mistrustful to their elites, are not so reluctant to see a political party, nevertheless, which is going to concentrate a lot of power in its hands. And my feeling is that for many people, the separation of power started to look as an alibi for the governments to pretend that they cannot do anything. And from this point of view, Mr. Kaczynski is touching on something real, talking about impossibilism. The idea is the only way to keep government responsible is to give them a lot of power. Of course, the risk is that when you give them a lot of power, they're probably never going to give you power back. But I do believe this tendency of liberal democracy, of power being so diffused that it cannot be controlled, is an interesting story. Because yesterday, when we had been talking about the commons and others, the problem with the diffused power is that you don't know whom to blame. And knowing whom to blame, in my view, is very important about democracy, because democracy is not only about redistribution of incomes, it's also about redistribution of blame. If you don't know who is guilty, you cannot control.
I do agree with the analysis, but partially, because I think that you cannot avoid mentioning, however, crisis situation, that liberal democracy functioned very well when, even with this situation without choice, because this is new. This is not new phenomenon, that people have an impression that first, there's no differences between political parties, Christian Democrats or Social Democrats. The differences are not very big, or post-Gaullists and socialists in France, and so on. But people accepted it. They were less enthusiastic. They participated less in the election, but they respected results because results were decent. The problem was that this situation without choice, when at the same time you have a feeling of the deep crisis and destabilization of the whole world, geopolitical, migration, and so on, then the problem of blaming, naming and blaming become much more important than in normal times. So I think there is a little bit of optimism in it, that it can be transitory stage as well, that this is connected very much to the crisis, to the crisis situation. But it also explains why the energy is flowing from political scene elsewhere, to social movement, to protest movement, different, because people, they do not believe in the efficiency. So expressive activity is more rewarding than citizens' obligation of voting when the results are not acceptable. So I think that this is, so we must also, in a way, retrospectively regard our times, that it can be transitory period. We shouldn't absolutize the period which is very difficult for Europe and for the countries, but let's hope that the end is at hand.
So if it's, as Ivan said, the madhouse against the prison, or if it's, as Aleksander Smolar said, if it's all about carnival, all about possibility to express my discontent without actually changing anything, whatever happened with the promise of, for example, Occupy movement or Indignados, that basically it all was supposed to lead to a kind of rediscovery of class interests and redefining of class interests. A lot of people were saying, well, what's so great about Occupy is that students are protesting along with trade unionists, that there is a possibility of discovering the new revolted social class, the precariat, and that the precariat will basically be a new social base for protest and for changing politics. And if it was supposed to lead to rediscovery or rethinking of the class interest, is there a return to this, or are we kind of forced to think about these new social movements only in terms of emotions, expressions, madhouse and the prison?
But listen, I don't believe that many of them are ready to use the class language. And from this point of view, Podemos is a classical example. Podemos is coming from a totally different tradition. If you see Ernesto Laclau and basically the idea of the populist reason, the idea is we don't want to be perceived as leftists anymore. We're going to construct the people, and this is very much about, it's not about left versus right, this is about below versus above, and they're constructing a very kind of a, it's not simply la casta, but they're talking about lumpen elite. So this is there. The problem with this type of a construction is, and they're not very different, they're putting different people under the idea of the people, but if you imagine that society is really divided between 99% and 1%, then the only enemy that you can have is the globalized elite. Nothing is happening inside. This is, by the way, even stronger in the discourse of some of the small far-right parties. For example, in Bulgaria, there is a party called Ataka, and they have two enemies, the globalized elite and the Roma. And according to them, these two groups are very much twins. They have three things in common. They're not like us. They're not part of a kind of a mainstream. Both of them are stealing, and both of them are supported by the West, I mean by the global world. So from this point of view, the idea of above and below very easily can be transformed from outside inside. You have a globalized elites and tribal migrants against the mainstream. And from this point of view, I do believe that, and I agree very much with Alec in this, that we're in a very interesting transitory moment, because what happened to Europe, I do believe to the United States, is in the last 3 or 4 years, we were forced to reperceive our own view of the world in which we are living. Because post-1989 world was created by the West, and now it is resented by the West. The fact that people outside of the West were resenting globalization, some of them, should not be surprised. But the crisis of the system comes when the winners start to question. And this is exactly what is happening. Look at the American elections. Listen, if you go on the economic programs between Trump and Hillary, you're going to be surprised that similarity is much closer than was on the previous elections between Obama and Romney. You have a new anti-globalization consensus, which is now very much covered by pushing on different other differences like race and gender and so on. But when it comes to free trade, you have a new consensus in the United States. All of them are against free trade. When it comes to migration, you have 2 different languages. But have you heard Hillary Clinton saying that she's going to open the borders? She said that she's not going to build walls. This is slightly different than basically open borders. So in a certain way, I do believe what is happening is that you start to redefine the world, and particularly the place of the West in the world. And here I want to give one, going back, because I do believe for me this was important. When in 1989 came the famous Fukuyama article, The End of History, and the article is much more interesting than the book, because what was interesting about the article that it obviously captured something that was a kind of emerging common sense. His major argument was, we're moving to the world where competition is going to be not between nations, but between companies and individuals. There are going to be conflicts. By the way, he never believed that there are not going to be conflicts, or there are not going to be reactionary movements. But because there is no universal alternative, according to him, borders are going to change their meaning. And this was the great also assumptions behind the European integration. After the World War I, the borders have been changed in order to go closer to the ethnic majorities. After World War II, people have been expelled in order basically to make places much more governable. After 1989, the idea was we are not going to change the border, we are not going to expel people, but the borders are going to be made unimportant. At the same time, when he wrote this, another American scholar, and by the way, he was also writing about Poland in the 1980s, Ken Jowett, wrote a book called The New World Disorder. He take many of the assumptions of Fukuyama. He said, they're not going to be universal challenge to liberal democracy, but as a result of it, you're going to see movements of rage, which are going to come. Secondly, he said, what we're going to see is a global identity politics. Everything is going to be about the borders, but not where the borders are, but about the nature of the borders. And I find this quite important, because I do believe that what we're discussing now is exactly about the nature of the borders. And I'm going to finish with the distinctions that he made, and which I found it very productive thinking about the world in which we are. He said there are 3 different types of borders. One he calls frontiers. This is like a singles bar. You go, you have a drink, you can have a sex, no identity. You don't remember either with whom you have drunken or with whom you have sex. And globalized world was like this. It doesn't create identity. And then as a reaction of this, you have the idea of borders like a barricade. And he had a very nice metaphorical language. It said it's like Catholic marriage. Marriage with no divorce. You have a forced identity. You can be only this. You cannot get out of this. But then he said liberal border is a border like marriage with divorce. You can change. You can negotiate. This is disappearing. I do believe we have this transition from the world in which borders and the absence of borders was perceived as advantage, as something that we have been really praising and enjoying. We like the world of tourists, and the next day, this same tourist came as a refugee, and to start hating him and to start fearing him, and this was the same person, and this was the same border. And I do believe that this, how we are renegotiating borders, is also going to be critical for our discussion about democracy. Democracy can be instrument of inclusion, and it could be instrument of exclusion. We assume for the last 25 years that it is instrument of inclusion only because minorities have been very much at the center of our interest. But what you see in the last 2 or 3 years, it's a search for majority. It's a search for majority group, and I'm going to end on this. I do believe that threatened majorities, majority groups that fear that in future they're going to turn into minority, particularly ethnic, whites in the United States and others, they're becoming the dominant force in politics. And this is why I don't fear that the next 10 years they're going to be classical new authoritarian regime arising. I'm afraid that democracy is going to function much more as an instrument for exclusion than the instrument for inclusion, exactly because they try to kind of have this identity function and identity building.
Let's say one remark, it is like quite often trade unions are acting today as a mechanism of defending those who are in the union against those who are outside. Now, one remark on different subjects. I do agree with what you said. We didn't mention, I mean, one spectacular case of the social movement, on the success social movements, although we do not know yet end results, and happening in Europe, and twice. This is the Maidan, the history of Maidan in Ukraine. And this is quite extraordinary. It was not organized by political parties. Political parties were absent. It was spontaneous social movement which twice forced authorities, authoritarian in the place, to resign, to abandon. We do not know the future development of Ukraine, especially because of the role of Russia, but still this is the case in a way. Traditionally, it's difficult to say because political party, no organization were not playing the role. This is the problem with social movements. Social movements are very quickly going to the top and afterwards decomposing because there is no 3 elements necessary for the survival of any institution. This is first, it is leadership, program, and organization. This is spontaneous movements, which, but in Ukraine, in Maidan, in Kiev, it survived and it succeeded. So it should be mentioned as a marginal note to what was said.
Allow me the last question before I give all of you opportunity to ask your questions and comment on what has been said. And let me turn our attention to the other side. The government, the mainstream parliamentary political parties, the institutionalized side. It seems to me that if conflicts over the definition of a border are the future of our politics, it seems to me that actually every major political party, left and right, will need a social movement of its own to legitimize itself. I mean, if we look at, for example, how Erdogan played with the coup, I mean, it was staged as a spontaneous resistance of the people against the coup, right? You probably all remember this really bizarre video made with a handy, with a mobile phone, in which he appeals to the people to basically come in the streets and stop and prevent coup from happening. A lot has been written about, for example, PiS, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, before they won the elections last year. That they actually were very actively organizing people in the streets too, basically to present themselves as an institutionalized version of a true social conflict that is there. So you had people demonstrating in the streets, demanding truth about the plane catastrophe in which the former president of Poland, Lech Kaczynski, died, and so on. So and this is becoming a widespread phenomenon of Tea Party in the U.S., of course. So it seems to me that creating, sponsoring, or fueling a social movement has become a way of legitimizing or partially legitimizing mainstream politics. Is that the future, basically?
One of the interesting stories which I have been reading much more closely is nobody can understand. There was one important kind of factual puzzles everybody who was following Russia in 2012, 2013. You have almost 1/3 of the population of the Russian Federation being very negative during the protests against President Putin. And then you have Crimea, and you have basically support for annexation of Crimea was higher in the cities which have been protesting against President Putin than in the other parts of Russia. Why? What has happened? And I do believe in order to understand this is to understand that these movements come with the keywords and key sentiments that can be mobilized by different actors. When people went on the street protesting against the Russian president and the rotation of power, there was a moral and also there was an aesthetic part of it. Because the two guys going, one said, I'm going to be president for a while, you're going to be prime minister, and then we're going to change. There was huge disrespect for the people that are voting. And the idea of dignity was very critical for people that have been on the street. It was the idea of dignity that President Putin used during the Ukrainian crisis, saying to the Russians, nobody respects us as a country. Can you be respected as a country? And then you ask your respect for the individual. I'm saying this because this energy are going to be used by different actors, and this is what's happening. Because anger, unlike ideology, is not something that basically you should agree on its principle. This is an energy that you're using for your political purposes. And I do believe we're going to see more of it because people are wanting something to happen, the idea that you want a change, nevertheless that you don't have a very clear idea how this change is going to look like, is pushing people to do much more radical things. See, for example, the words being used for elections. Normally we knew that there is a regime in which power is decided by elections, and there are others in which you have revolutions or coup d'etat. Now many people are talking about the elections as either promising you revolutions through elections, or when you're losing elections, you're saying it was a coup. And I find this quite important, but what makes me, and again, I'm talking very much about the West versus the rest, because nevertheless the protests are the same, the dynamics is different. Universalism, and this was part of very interesting debate that we have these 2 days. What I'm going to say is not going to be very popular, but I have noticed that countries and societies tend to be universalist when they feel powerful. Power goes with the universalism. Basically, when you're in expansion, look at the European Union. When the European Union was self-confident, interested in others, what is happening, its neighbors, you believe that you are there to transform the world. And because you are there to transform the world, you talk about your values, you also, in your own way, successfully or not, try to be interested in the positions of others because you believe that others want to be like you. And then comes the moment when you start to experience decline of power. And then the question comes not how you're transforming the world, but how the world is starting to transform you. And by the way, this is the major story which you can see. Basically, I will give one example again about the American elections. Listen, for the 20 years we have been talking about how we're going to transform Russia, and now we're discussing basically how Russia is going to transform the United States, electing them president, doing this or that. This is a different question, based on a totally different understanding of what future has for you. As a result of it, you start to claim your exceptionalism, not your universalism. You basically you're in a strange way losing interest in others. You're starting to understand who are we, why we're doing this, what is our identity. And this is what makes me nervous about some of the movements and energy that we're going to see on the streets of United States or in the streets of Europe. Most of them are going to come with this type of questions. This is going to be a much more defensive type of universalism when you're using your universalism much more to fight somebody else than to integrate it. And this is why I want to repeat something that I could be wrong, but for me comes very important. Do you know, I was alive and young during the end of socialism, and there was one phrase I could not stand during these days, and this was that the problem of socialism are going to be solved with more socialism. I don't know if those of you who remember, but this was. And now when I'm listening to some of the talk coming from the European Union is that the problems of Europe are going to be solved with more Europe, or the problems of democracy are going to be solved with more democracy. First, I don't know what it means. I don't know what more democracy means, and I don't know what more Europe means. But this type of tautological thinking is already telling you something about your understanding of the future. And basically, what you feel about the future is try to prevent it to come. And this is part of the energies which kind of I find problematic.
I do agree with the diagnosis. I have a partly different explanation of what is happening. I think that after the period of liberalism excessive, after Reagan and Thatcher, and individualism as a foundation, individual way of survival, and our part of the world was contaminated very much with it. There was no collective projects, really, individual way, that the common developments through individual energy, creativity, and so on. And with the crisis, this period, it finished. Also with what Ivan was saying beforehand, that we believed, the generation of parents believed that the next generation will be in better situation, and now the youngster, they hope that their situation will be at least as their parents. So in a way, that this optimism disappeared, but also we did disappear this sort of individualistic perception of the progress. What is the game of the town? This is collective project, not individual projects. And the feeling of belongingness is much more important today than the feeling of advancement individual. And this is the paradoxical problem, the impact of it on the restructuring of the political space. Or the right has a quite natural answer to this problem. This is the nation state, and in certain countries like Poland, for example, religion. This is our real values, real stuff, and easy identification with. And you can see this is unbelievable manifestation, public manifestation, especially by the young people, of their patriotism. They are different, nicer and less nicer, but this is a public, this is the, it's became something extremely popular in a few days, the 11th, this is the anniversary of Polish independence after, in 1918, we will see public manifestation everywhere, and quite often conflictual. And at the same time, today, and this is more general statement than about Central Europe, my impression is that the left and the center have no answer of this value, of this intensity, of such a emotional mobilization. The traditional leftist, or let's say social democratic answer, it was welfare states. It means that the states will assure dignity to all citizens, and of course connected with the dignity of the citizen. With the crisis of democracy, with the feeling that the states cannot do anything, and the crisis of the welfare state, you know, since the 70s, this message is much weaker, and both the left and the liberal center has problem with formulating collective answer, not individualistic answer, but collective answer. And I think that this is very important factor. And if you observe from Republican candidate in the United States to all populist leaders, not only populist leaders, the patriotism or nationalism, you know, Erdogan, everywhere. And this is connected very much with the same, I didn't answer to what Ivan said before, the cult of the strong man. And on both sides of the division, authoritarian, but also in the democratic case, because you believe, at least when you do not believe in the rules of the game, you believe in the qualities of men, of exceptional men, special men. The danger for democracy are quite obvious of this. Thank you.
We'll be happy to take your questions and listen to your comments. There's 1, 2, and 3 there.
Thank you. So the title of this debate is How do Social Movements Change Politics? And what I take to be Aleksander Smolar's response is, well, maybe they don't, because maybe all of this is temporary. Maybe it's a kind of carnival, and then we can go back to normal.
It was Bauman's answer. It was not
yes, but I take it to be a suggestion that maybe this is the case. So if it is not, I would like you to clearly state how would you imagine a liberal response to what's happening. And the same question to Ivan Krastev, who interestingly said that they changed politics into a more illiberal direction. But what interests me is how would you imagine a liberal response to what's happening? Thank you.
No, I do believe that we go to a much more critical question about the nature and the conditions for liberal democracy, not for democracy at all. And one of the things that I'm starting to suspect, and probably it's interesting to discuss, is we always was talking about economic preconditions. Przeworski's famous story about democracy, we're talking about institutional preconditions. But to what extent the success of the liberal democracies for the last 25 years, I mean success to emerge globally, was not the result of two other factors. One was very much power-related, the American dominance in the world, which should not be neglected. But secondly, the existence of a very particular experience of a country's coming from the communist system, which has a very particular sensitivity for certain type of problems for which liberalism was an answer. I mean the abuse of the state power. Because I do believe that the category which is mostly missing for me in our discussions about democracy is experience, particularly collective generational experiences. And one of the things that also I do believe we see in Central and Eastern Europe, and this is why you have two different protests, and one of the people, basically, the older generation go on a demonstration to defend the Constitutional Court, and the other basically go on abortion, is that they come from two totally different experiences. The experience on which the liberal democracy is based is quite exceptional. Because like Danny Roderick was making in a recent article is, in order to have a liberal democracy, there's three things basically to be there. You have, according to him, protection of rights, protection of the right of the majority to govern, and the protection of the minority rights. When it comes to the property rights, you know why they're going to succeed, because there are powerful groups behind them. The powerful people are behind protecting rights, so it's obvious. When it comes to the rights of the majority to govern, it's also clear, because the majorities are there. But why the rights of the minority are going to be protected? Who is so much interested in this? And I do believe only a very specific constellations of power and experiences makes people believe that protecting minority rights, the rights of others, are important for your own well-being. When this experience is not there, then comes the story, how liberal democracy is going to answer, for example, the problem of the open borders. Huge question. Huge question. If you're going to be consistent with your liberal views, and there was in the first, in the keynote speech, it was very clear. Either universal citizenship, everybody can go, but then every common is a global common, which means that everybody has the right to participate in any referendum anywhere in the world, because it's our global commons. Or you should make the nation states so beautiful and so nice that nobody's going to be interested to leave it. And we know that both options, in practical terms, are not something that is going to happen. And I do believe that liberals now are facing a very particular problem, which is intellectual in its nature. The thing which is the best and the worst for us is the same thing. Open borders. Listen, this is the best that can happen, and it could be the worst that can happen. And we don't know how to distinguish it. We don't know how to talk about this. By the way, this is the problem of the European Union. European Union is based on one major assumption. Interdependency produces security. At some point, some people start to suspect that interdependency also can produce insecurity. And by the way, the historical study on this, how to talk about this. And as a result of it, people now talk a lot about populists and others. I do believe that the major figure in the debate to come is going to be the ex-liberals. Mr. Orban is an example of this. Mr. Kaczynski is not. He's a consistent man who I don't believe that changed his views for the last 25 years. While you have a lot of people who go and they said, oh, I was part of this liberal paradigm, it didn't work, it didn't solve any of the problems, I'm going there. And ex-liberals, in the way the ex-communists were very critical for delegitimizing the communist system. The ex-liberals are becoming a major intellectual figures. And also what many people believed is that you cannot delegitimize liberal democracy because there is no clear alternative. Let's give you an example how you can delegitimize the system without offering an alternative. For example, President Putin is not offering any alternative. The fact that he's offering conservative view and so on, everybody who has been in Russia for more than 2 hours knows that it's not middle America evangelical society. But basically, he's delegitimizing the international order by doing something that looks very strange from the beginning. He said, I'm going to do to you what you're doing to me, aggressive imitation, and through aggressive imitation, trying to delegitimize the system itself. For example, 10 years ago, he's going to say to the American president, don't interfere in Russian politics. Don't give money to the liberal NGOs. Don't do this, don't do that. 5 years ago, he's going to create a foreign agents law preventing giving this money. Now he's doing something totally different. He said, then I can give money to your candidate. I can hack your emails. So now you feel how I feel? This type of delegitimation through aggressive imitation, I do believe is something that is starting to happen also on the domestic politics in many places. And this is where, for the liberals, it's very difficult to have a response, because liberalism, and here Judith Sklar was mentioned yesterday, is very much rooted in the European experience of 1930s and then 1950s. Without the totalitarian experience or the totalizing experience of the French Revolution, for example, before, it's not very easy how people are becoming liberals and doing things like tolerating minorities, respecting others, putting institutional constraints on their own power. So this is why I do believe that the nature of the experience is as important for the regimes as the nature of the institutions. And then for me, the question is how we can use some of the disappointment with some of the performance of the populist parties, of what they're doing, of how they're doing this, to what extent it confronts some of our basic human instincts about what is decent and what is not decent, to bring back some of this liberal sensitivity.
Very short answer to your question. I quoted Bauman as an example of total powerlessness. He didn't believe at all. You have other extremes. Let's quote, for he Michnik. He believes that only code can assure the change next of the power. Of course, he doesn't mean that God will present, this Committee of Defense of Democracy will present itself in the parliament, but it will be sort of meta structure which will impose the unity to different political organizations. I think that both answers are not satisfying to me. I think that those public activities, manifestation, this is the lesson of active citizens protesting. What will come out of it, whether the lesson of further engagement or rather disillusionment, we cannot tell it, because it depends also about the consequences, impact upon the political party functioning. I don't believe that you can eliminate political party from the landscape. The problem of this connection between social movements and political parties, whether people have a feeling that they can influence, not directly. They know that they are stressing all the time. They don't want to abolish the regime. They don't want to destroy the power. They're recognizing all the time, stressing the consequences of the election of peace of Mr. Kaczynski and so on. No, they want to protest. They want to impose certain limitation upon the policy they are considering as a dangerous for Poland or for democracy in Poland. So much more complex and predictable process. I think that this is very important element of the functioning of democracy, and this is extremely interesting because this is the first case of such a massive manifestation of the young people as about the recent law and about intelligentsia, middle-aged and older intelligentsia. It was also for the first time in 27 years. So this is, I think this is extremely important, but you cannot predict the future. This is the statement about today's situation, whether we will have more apathy or another way around. It will depend upon the people, upon behavior of the authorities as well. They are committing a lot of mistakes. I think that they are the biggest enemies of themselves.
We have a question from upstairs and then 2 more questions from this part of the room.
It's more a comment to Ivan than a question. I agree basically with everything you said, but there's one point I really do not agree. And it's a major point because it's about your pessimism. And the point is you call these movements, these leaders, Erdogan, Trump, peace, Fidesz, and so on, movements for majoritarian democracy. And you should call them authoritarian or even totalitarian. And that's a major point. If you remind, in history, we had a party, a worker party, a socialist democratic party, and one fraction of this party called itself the Bolsheviks. So the majority, and they were the minority. It was an alleged majority. And they possibly were a majority in a certain very short point in time. And at the very moment when they got the minority, it was the cult of the leader and violence which they used to stay in power. And this is the ideology and this is the genetic code of all these movements and all these leaders. And that's why they are not representatives of another type of democracy, of a majoritarian type, but they're representatives of not only a liberal but authoritarian and potentially, as we see in Russia, if we see the trajectory from 2000 to 2016, potentially totalitarian type of politics and policy.
Let's get the remaining questions. We have one question here. Ira has a question, and there is another question from there. And we'll have to probably stop at that because we are already running out of time. Sorry, could you pass the mic, and then you will have a chance.
Aleksander Smolar used a word that I've been waiting to hear all day, and that's religion. I'd like to hear more about social energy and effervescence and religion generally and how politics connect to this. Obviously, religions worldwide are very often linked to resentment mobilizations. We know this, for better or worse. And I'm thinking particularly of Durkheim and the idea of religion as an expression of the way a group is conscious of itself, is sort of aware of itself, and the way this can create this mobilizing effervescence. Polish solidarity obviously reflected this, and there are other such expressions in the world today. So what do you think is the link between beliefs, symbols, rituals, mobilizations, political transformation and democracy?
Okay, let's collect the remaining questions.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask such a question. Why social movement changing politics in such extent now? And there are a few points. First is, supposedly, first argument is such that political classes they are not trustworthy any longer. There was a famous British politologist called Peter Auburn who in 2007 wrote a book called The Triumph of Political Class, in which he predicted that what we have now as a representative democracy will turn toward democratic oligarchy. And as long as state can control information flow, then system would be maintained. But social networking and generally virtual revolution change everything forever, because social movement, usually when we look at them, they are populist. In Margaret Canavan categorization, they would be either democratic or reactionary, so would be Pegida or Committee of Defense of Democracy in Poland, for instance. But anyway, they have this potential of populism. And what is important in modern day political discourse is such a visibility that populists start to be part of mainstream of democracy. And this is because populism emerge usually in time of incorrectness. So there is some social incorrectness in the system and have to be changed. So I am quoting Ernesto Laclau, who is a kind of intellectual leader of Podemos movement, for instance. And then there is another factor. Before social media, those movements were not able to be visible because their stances would be not amplified, whether they are right-wing or left-wing or another. And then there is this amplification which allows this visibility of some range of social movement. And this is important point because, for instance, when you're looking at that last point, Donald Trump, when you're looking at the convention in the United States just before election, and you see this well-prepared convention of Donald Trump with music, with this theatrical gesturing, and then you compare it with Hillary Clinton, you start to think about some important mechanism, which is cultivation theory. Because cultivation theory is this idea that the more you watch something, the more you believe in it. And it was started in the 60s by Mr. Gerbner in the United States, but then was widely contested by social media, especially YouTube. When you're watching some material on some political movement, for instance, next material you will watch will be the same. Kind of. For instance, you're watching Donald Trump, you will be watching more Donald Trump, not Hillary Clinton rather. Which means that those information which are not segregated or filtered by state would simply reach audience, and this audience would have simpler possibilities to be radicalized. And supposedly that's at the end of my statement. This is short described mechanism how the social movement would gain more power and would be more visible and would have more influence on modern day politics because they have to be taken into account as a social player. Thank you very much.
And the last comment question from Ira Katznelson, please.
Thank you. So first, thanks for this enormously stimulating discussion. If I can climb up a ladder of abstraction, one or two rungs, I heard a series of very fascinating, provocative, stimulating hypotheses about three different linkages or relationships. One is the relationship between a new structure of the situation, and we could debate what that new structure is. Is it to do with globalization, with the digital revolution, with the crisis of capitalism? You could name the structure of the situation. The relationship between the structure and human experience. How do different people situated in different locations experience this structural change? That's one, and you both gave us some hypotheses about the relationship between structure and experience. A second zone which you've addressed is the relationship, complicated relationship between persons' experiences and the understanding, the dispositions, the tools they use to make sense of those experiences. Third and last of the linkages I heard was a question of how people with certain dispositions to understand their experience do or do not behave. So the relationship between interpretation and behavior. And my question would be, since I believe myself that there is a kind of underdetermination in each of those stories. That is, structure doesn't automatically lead to this or that experience. This or that experience does not automatically lead to this interpretation. And this interpretation does not automatically lead to behavior. My question is, what is it about the nature of institutional design in a broadly democratic or liberal democratic frame that does or could affect the way in which determination or causation occurs in each of these three zones?
start. Let's start from the question how to call them. And of course, I do believe that you have a very strong authoritarian tendencies in these governments. But what is distinctive, for example, between places like Turkey and Russia is you have a competitive elections. If you go to Przeworski's minimalist view of democracy, that you have an elections where basically the government can lose power, theoretically it's still true for Turkey. And I'm saying this because when we start and when we use term authoritarianism, there is a very hidden assumption that authoritarian regimes are much more based on violence and repression, and they do not represent the view of the majority. I do believe that we are facing a situation which is much more uncomfortable for us because some of these regimes do represent the public opinion in their countries. If you see the support of the Turkish public for anti-Kurdish basically actions of the Turkish regime, as you know, yesterday they basically arrested all of the Kurdish members of parliament. This is much more troubling than the authoritarian nature of President Erdogan personally. The easiest story with totalitarian regimes where the elections was just a fake was that we can easily imagine a public that we like. We can much more easily say, listen, this people does not speak on behalf of their own publics. But this is much more, for me, the radicalization of the publics, why the publics support this. And this is why I insist putting majoritarian democracy in order not to allow somebody else to replace the problem of what's happening in Turkey was basically who is Mr. Erdogan, and we know who Mr. Erdogan is, and so on. Second, basically going to your question, one of the interesting story about populism, liberalism, and so on is that de facto, in a populist situation, you have two positions. You do not have a clear liberal position. You have a populist position and anti-populist position. And from this point of view, the American elections are a great example on this. Mrs. Clinton is not so much fighting the policy ideas of Donald Trump, if he has some. It's much more discrediting the person and saying he's not fit to govern. And I do believe this is quite important, and this is how this type of a populist movements are changing the nature of the political competition and not simply the nature of the political parties. And I do believe this is quite important because then the question is who can govern, whom you can trust to govern in a situation like this. And then we come to the third question, which comes from Ira, and which is very, it is a really difficult one. Listen, I do believe that institutions matters, and I'm just going to give one example. One of the things that I do believe we have as one of the reasons for the high level of political polarization in the United States politics has a lot to do with the institutional decisions, and some of them has to do a lot with communications and others. And this is redistricting of the American electoral districts. 70% of the Americans are living in one-party states. As a result of it, the nature of the political competition in these districts has totally changed. You should be as wild as possible in order to be elected in this. There is no any pressure for moderation. But even more what is happening is that 40 years ago, 50% of the Americans have been living in counties where one or the other party can win the elections. Now 70% of the Americans are living in a county in which one of the parties is winning with landslide, which means that as a result of the market, and because market is very much empowering us to follow our natural choices, and our natural choices is to have a business with people like us, people that we like. Ghettoization is coming very much out of this. The common space is disappearing. When you go to New York, you're not going to see anybody who is going to vote for Trump. You don't believe that Trump exists. And then when you go to other parts of the United States, you're not going to see anybody who is not going to vote for Trump. But the problem between these two groups is that they know about each other, but they're not part of a common space anymore. And I do believe that destruction of the common experience, and here comes the story. Common experience was produced in European history. One of the most important common experience was the experience of the World War II. It's not by accident that Tony Judd entitled his History of Europe in the last 50 years post-war. Because there was something very common between the Europeans that have been on the different sides of the front. And this is the war, the experience of the war, the everything going with the war. So you have a common reference. You have this common experience, which I do believe common experience is one of the major preconditions of democracy. And here comes the nation state. Nation state, unlike internet and unlike market, is pushing people to have a common experiences. Normally, the nation state and the welfare state are putting people to be soldiers together, to go in the public schools together. You are forced to communicate with people who are not exactly like you, because social cohesion was one of the major values of the welfare state of the post-war period. Social cohesion is not a value anymore, because people are living now in a very comfortable bubbles, but these bubbles are very comfortable. How many of us are getting the information from sources that you don't like? So as a result of it, I do believe that this separation, which goes on the level of society, is one of the preconditions why certain type of experiences go to these political polarizations and others. It was institutional choices. And these institutional choices empowered a tendency that makes much more difficult for the situation for American democracy to produce moderation, for which it was kind of famous before. And then as a result of it, I do believe, and I'm going to stop here, when you have this type of a lack of a common experience, understanding others is becoming very difficult. It's become now very difficult for us to put ourselves in a position of the people who are voting for parties that we don't understand. There is a very strong idea to try to criminalize the position of the other, to try to believe that this is why the idea of madness and the idea of the prison is so powerful, because with the criminals and with crazies, you don't need to argue. And by the way, this I see as one of the very weaknesses of the liberal position. I have been part of many debates in which the idea is, can we invite somebody, for example, why there is nobody of the right-wing populist part of this discussion? Because we always believe that it's a kind of, we are privileged people talking to them. But the lack of this encounter basically makes a situation in which we talk about other people's ideas without engaging with them. And this is creating a world which is very comfortable, but after that basically does not work. And I do believe all these type of social changes, and internet very much contributed for this, and institutional changes also contributed for this, very much explain this type of linkages. I very much agree that if certain type of institutional changes are going to come, they can change the nature of this linkage. The problem is where the willingness to make these changes comes in a situation in which the common space have been lost. For example, is it possible for people to defend the freedom of media if they don't trust any particular media? Because if you see how long, and this, yeah, but let's stop here.
Final response from Aleksander Smolar.
The time is over. There's one question posed which was concerned Poland and the problem of the church. I formulate in very general terms. So there's a small book by Michael Walzer, American political philosopher of the left, last year published, which is based on the three experiences of India, Algeria, and Israel, with the quite shocking conclusions that the revolution, national revolution, but those were modernization revolution as well, that they were assured by the secular elites, West-oriented elites. And more or less, 25 years later, we have the reaction, which is the radical religious reaction in three countries. So he knows much better Israel than to others. You can question some conclusions, but it seems to be exactly the case of Poland. 25 years later, what we can observe in Poland, and this is partly communicate with what Ivan said, the language in Poland today, this is sometimes quite shocking from the governmental, the camp, the people who govern the Poland. They are calling that leftists are governing, for example, in Brussels, although the majority there is the biggest, this is the People's Party, which is Christian Democratic, let's say, but in Polish language of the official camp, they are leftists. They are leftists, and all culture, and for example, for them, even conservatives, British, because they recognize the marriages of homosexuals, they are leftists. And Mrs. Merkel, this is quite obvious. You know, Orban, if you remember, when he was in Poland, he was speaking about contra-revolution in Europe. And Kaczynski confirmed that this is the project. You should treat seriously such a declaration as self-description of people they are using. I think that this is the name which is the most adequate. This is not totalitarian. This is not dictatorship, and about future we knows nothing. But this is counter-revolution. Those regimes are counter-revolutionaries. They are hostile to up to the Enlightenment traditions quite openly. You know. Although, for example, John Paul II, which is a sort of course national hero, was very ambiguous about the Enlightenment, that he accepted a lot of elements of Enlightenment. Today, in Polish Church, you will never hear about it. And most of the Polish Church, and here this is not surprising that the chief of the conference of the bishops of Poland, he was saying that we never had such a good relation with government as with today's government. You know, that this is, you know, this is a project which is, I think, totally contra-revolutionaries. They were revolutionaries. This is totally utopian revolutionary project. I'm convinced that it will fail, but they will destroy a lot of things. They are destroying a lot of things, you know, today. So this is also the, let's say, the revolution against the West. But of course, as a consequence of suffering of the people, which was underestimated in the West, and also in elites in our countries, suffering of the transition periods of big part of the population. The costs were enormous. And this part of the population which paid the highest cost is revolting and is supporting the power, today's power.
Thank you very much, and we reconvene after a short break.
Sorry, I was very wrong.